Today on Rebuilders, we are looking at some data from across the world.
Yeah, we are asking the question, is the sort of mode of renewal changing? There's been a lot of contending prayer, there's been a lot of pressing in. What if actually things are starting to change? We look at some really exciting data coming around from the world and ask, how do we adapt to the new opportunity that is emerging before us?
Yeah, we're really looking forward to sharing today's episode with you. Welcome to Rebuilders. My name is Liddy and I'm here with Mark and Daniel. How are you both today?
We're good. Good to have you back.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
Daniel did a fantastic job.
He did.
Although one error.
I did really good.
We had the audience who got some, encouraging messages. But one thing to just rectify is that there was I would go as far to call it a vicious slander.
Yes.
Of you, Liddy.
Yeah.
That Daniel said that you'd sent through a picture of you eating cold oats.
Yeah. For the record, they were warm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there was no way to know. And because we had talked about the previous day, I was operating the assumption that you were just joining the party of cold oats. However, I'm looking at the picture now and look, we could put this in subscriber chats even if people want.
I think
there's
Liddy wants her breakfast in subscriber chats.
Floating banana in custard. I don't even see oats in there.
Not custard again.
Look,
Yeah,
I'm not, and I'm not mad about it.
Just
either.
let it go. Custard is not going to become a breakfast.
I've definitely had custard at breakfast before.
Have you?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know if I've tried that, but it might be time.
It's time, Daniel. It's time. Not in that picture though. That was just milk and bananas and porridge underneath.
Just don't do it before a Rebuilders episode. You'll be having a sugar/high fat content crash.
Just passed out behind the desk.
Yes.
So anyway, no, thanks for joining the cold oat party.
In your dreams.
Yes.
Well, it's good to be back and great episode last week, guys.
Thank you.
But the following morning.
I know. Yeah, we had. I think we had 4 options that Trump would do, and he sort of did a 5th, which was sort of a pause. There's not really a pause for 90 days, and the tariff's still on. And then, I think it was a pause on some of the higher ones, but then the China one went up, and then sort of China and the US seemed to be in some kind of battle royale, which continues. I just saw China's just told its local aviation industry to stop buying Boeing. We had a sort of pause on some of the sort of what seemed like the tariff on some of the different sort of like phones and computers. But then, Howard Lutnick comes out, within a few hours and goes, oh, no, it actually is. It's in the 45% bucket, which is still really bad, or 25% of whatever the heck it is. So just chaos reigns. There's a lot of volatility. But the one sure thing is, it's not going away.
Yeah.
And it continues, and its disruption in the markets, particularly the bond market, is really what is to watch now. The US dollar, is weakening. So the US's financial clout and power in the world, which has been solidified in the global trading system, particularly since Nixon floated or took the dollar away from being connected to gold. Some people sort of saying is in threat, but that's not what we're talking about today.
No. We are still talking about chaos in a way.
Yeah.
But what is the big spiritual trend in all of this chaos?
Well, I think just to sort of give a little bit of background for this too, particularly with this news around the markets and just so much change, so much details, and particularly if you're not, au fait with all of the different sort of like financial terms and stuff like that, something big's happening and it's chaos, but you don't really, understand what. And, even travel, you know what I mean? Like, it's being affected, and trade and all these things. But I just thought it'd be just good to, one thing we want to do is we want to narrate what's going on, but we also want to step back, as we've always done since we really sort of kicked off, in the pandemic, a bit before the pandemic, but I think, we sort of hit our stride in the pandemic, in the midst of all these daily disruptions that are happening. What's the big spiritual trend behind it all?
Yes. So today we're going to be looking at a bit of a shift in the mode of renewal. We've been talking about renewal for a long time.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's our big theme today, that there's a shift going on that we need to respond to. I think about, I've shared this story before that, God really gave me a heart for renewal in 2017 when, I think, there was just a sense of the difficulty of doing church at this time. You sort of saw this slow drip of people seeming to be leaving the church. Discipleship, was really hard to often communicate to people. People often sort of felt like they had a foot in the world, foot in the church. And then they're just particularly, in our context, but I think all over the place in large parts of the West, there seemed to be this growing antagonism towards faith, and it just sort of felt like it was a bit of a grim holding on, I think I remember speaking at a conference around there, it was like called Stand Firm. It was almost this sense of being there. It's just like, just hang on in the midst of this sort of storm. And so, part of then the sort of heart that God planted in me, and I read about this in Reappearing Church, and then, you saw this as COVID, the crisis of COVID hit. In a sense, I've thought of it as like traffic lights. Like COVID was almost this sort of red light for so many people. So many of the stuff that people was doing had to stop. You had to adapt. And, all of a sudden, what looked strong previously all felt weak. And that sort of then went into this almost amber light, this yellow light of sort of contending. Like we're at this desperate point, what worked before isn't working now. Let's just call on God to move. And you saw lots of videos at that time, and it predates this, but there was just a lot of videos online of people sort of in circles worshiping, crying out to God for God to move and so on. And, very much we saw that sort of contending prayer, prevailing prayer, that sort of desire for just, God, would you do something? We're at this absolute desperate point.
Yes.
And then as, coming out of COVID into all the, so many other cultural trends that happened from, cultural tumult, polarization, different places to war and climate disasters and all kinds of things, inflation, returning cost of living and so on, that contending prayer intensified, And then you had things like Asbury and so on, and then spot fires that we were talking about, like something began to happen in different places. So you went from 2017, we were just like, God, please just make something happen, to all of a sudden sort of in many places some people had left the church. It had created a bit more of a remnant church, and then there was remnants within the remnant who were sort of contending and crying out. And it sort of felt like, we've got to push into faithfulness and consecration, giving of everything. But I just wonder whether we are moving now from the amber light. So let's just say COVID was a red light where so many things stopped, and that was different wherever you were in the world.
Sure.
For us in Melbourne, it was a couple of years. And then you sort of went through this sort of amber. It was a lot of conflict, chaos, cultural tumult, contending prayer. And then I'm just going to sort of argue that perhaps we're moving into a green light moment. And so it's a different mode of renewal. And, we talked about before, we did an episode on revivalism versus, revival. Revivalism is almost trying to find the techniques and tactics that worked at the last revival and then repeat them. So there's a sense of like, I feel at the moment there's a danger of some of those spot fires where God was sort of breaking out, let's go back and try and get that again, and God's still moving, and God can do those things. So I'm not saying we shouldn't be praying, contending prayer, prevailing prayer, or anything like that. We need to prayer needs to be a huge part of what we're doing. I think it's one thing we learned from the last season, dependency and so on. But I just think that something out there is happening. And two things. One is, as we're going to discuss, I think prayers are being answered, and the fruit of faithfulness is fruiting on the trees.
Yes.
But I think there's a little bit of a danger that just as a lot of people went from full steam ahead to having to, pivot for COVID, and then people are, still sort of trying to answer the cultural war and polarization and how do we contend, and they're still in that place. A new phase may be coming that we may miss. Moving from crisis of the red light, COVID, stabilization of the amber light.
Yes.
But now are we sort of moving into a phase of advancing?
Yes.
So I thought it'd be good to look at that.
Great. Looking forward to it. We're going to kick off by looking at a bunch of data.
Yes.
Things that are sort of indicating that this green light is emerging.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's really noted was there were two trends emerging. One, there was a trend of, let's call it the trend of spot fires. We started getting a lot of mail. You saw events, a lot of young people, but others, I think about when, we've been around the country a couple of times, like something different, people sort of crying out for God to move, extended periods of worship, stuff like this happening, prayer growing, and interest in prayer. But then there's been this other trend which almost took people by surprise. And I'm not going to go through this data in great detail. We'll go through it in a little bit. But just you began to see these good news stories coming in. Some of this also came off the back of seeing I won't go into this, but we've talked about this before, some prominent public figures coming to faith or moving from atheism to agnosticism or agnosticism to some sort of faith.
Yeah.
We've talked about that before. And so you sort of a lot of anecdotal stuff, we've had it, people sort of turning up, all of a sudden people who say running an alpha course, more people coming to faith or more people interested. But then you start to get the data come through, so, think about the Times article in the UK, where church attendance from 18 to 24, I think went from 4% or something in 2018 to like 16%, in just before COVID to after COVID. So that's literally that period where I'm praying, where God placed a sort of passion in my heart to pray for renewal. That's around then, so that's 4%. But then, you look in the UK in 2024, 16%, it's a significant uptick. You've seen the growth in Bible sales up 87%, in the UK. Barna just, released some new statistics, and, there's an uptick in, faith amongst Gen Zs in the United States. Also seen a rise in Bibles being purchased in the United States, like in the UK, by first-time believers. So you're seeing that rise go up, which is really interesting. And going back to the UK, there's multiple sort of surveys that are saying this now, and to the point where it's sort of in the public,
like
sort of
mainstream
discussion.
media.
Yeah, totally. France, adult baptisms up 45% in 2025, and 36% of these were 18 to 25-year-olds. Yahoo News is reporting. In Finland, young male church attendance doubled in 8 years. Belief in God amongst confirmants, so people who are getting confirmed into the Church of Finland or whatever it is, 33 to 66%. In Sweden, youth is growing. Again, often Sweden, places like Finland and Sweden were spoken about as very secular places. So sort of free churches growing and Pentecostal groups growing in Sweden. So you're seeing across. I'll talk about Australia in a second because this week I was part of a sort of release. I was invited to a release of some sort of data from our census, which is really interesting.
Sure.
But definitely what you're seeing out of Northern Europe, and there is some stories, even in Southern Europe, you're hearing a lot of anecdotal stuff. But this is sort of like various articles in Yahoo News or different places that you're starting to see. Is it massive? Is it culture wide? No, but you're starting to see momentum, particularly amongst the young and Gen Z, who all of a sudden are looking at Christianity in a very different way and moving towards commitment in Christianity, which is really interesting.
So, Mark, do you think the trend overall is indicating that this is about Gen Z?
Yeah. So there's something happening clearly in certain places in that demographic. That's very clear to see. And, it's not just in one country, it's in multiple countries. There are some nuances, like some of the Barna detail from what I've read is that it's not necessarily always translating into church attendance. In the UK, it seems to be. And you're seeing in Europe, Catholic churches growing. You're seeing sort of charismatic and Pentecostal churches growing in other places. So, perhaps in Europe where the sort of culture war thing hasn't been as connected to church in the way that it has in the US, you are seeing this translate into sort of church attendance. But clearly Christianity and how culture sees Christianity or parts of culture is changing. And there's a spiritual openness that we've not seen before. And again, I was trying to think about like, when has this happened before? I'm struggling to think in my lifetime when this seems to have happened before. There's always been the sort of like stats that come out that this many people are interested in spirituality, but not necessarily interested in Christianity per se. So what was interesting too is I sort of went to this one in Australia. So McCrindle, who do research here, released a report which was from our national census, And so classically, when the national census happens every 4 or 5 years, I think is in Australia, and there's about a day or two of news that comes out of that, they'll find some trend line to report on. And the big story in Australia has been of the move from people who identify as Christian in the census to nuns, or no religion, is the term. But what's really interesting, they reported that, in Australia, in the last census, which is 2016 to 2021, Australia's 26 million people. What are we now, 27? How many people in Australia? Just every time I say this stat, it's grown because we seem to be growing at such a rate at the moment.
As of 2023, it's 26.66 million.
Okay, 20 points. It's probably 30 now. No. So in that census, 2016 to 2021, which again too is that period we're talking about here, 785,000 people in Australia moved from no religion to Christianity. So two things are happening. One is people who were culturally Christian, tick the box, never went to church, barely believed any of it, basically are now going, what's the point putting this? That's very much the story.
Or like went to a Christian school and I must be a Christian.
Grandma was a Christian.
Sure.
I'm Greek Orthodox. I guess I'm Greek, so I'm a Greek Orthodox. That sort of stuff. Increasingly those people are not putting Christian on the Australian government census, but then there's this large group of people who have gone from zero faith to faith. And there's a genuineness in that. That's less about a religious, what the research seems to be saying is that's less about a religious identification on a census as it is about a genuine conversion. And what was really interesting, so hearing this, my brain then went, well, this is going to be what we're seeing in other places. This is going to be Gen Z, this is going to be 18 to 25s. Yeah. This is going to be, Australia has massively, we're one of the most multicultural countries in the world, had large amounts of migration. That's what it's going to be. And very much the church in Australia in the 80s and 90s, was really bolstered by migration, particularly from places like, Chinese people come from Singapore and Indonesian people, people come from Malaysia, Southeast Asia and other places, Sri Lanka and so on. But what's really interesting, and also Catholic populations from Southern Europe, etc. But what's really interesting is the group which is coming to faith in Australia is the over 55s.
Wow.
Which really surprised me. And then I'm thinking, well, it's also going to be migrants. And in fact, migrants in some ways, what the research is sort of saying are not growing the church in Australia and in a sense are more resistant than in the past. And that's, for a couple of reasons when you dig into that. So sort of my read on some of this is, one other thing, and this is your guys' demographic bucket. Millennials are really open to faith in Australia, and the most committed churchgoers, 75% roughly of millennials who ticked yes, I'm a Christian on the census in Australia, are regular and engaged churchgoers, which is so goes against the narrative that's often around. Also different to what's happening. So some of the Times article in the UK was very much, well, there was an article that was written by a millennial, so maybe it's just her, but she was sort of saying, my generation's almost deconstructing and we're not really into this, but the Gen Z seem to be into it. Well, Australia, something different's happening. So, to take this apart, because I think there's a bigger trend underneath all of this.
Sure.
And so I think what's happening in Australia is, for people who don't know, migrants in Australia, we have a points-based migration system. So migrants who are coming to Australia tend to have money. And, we had like a golden ticket sort of thing, which Trump's just brought in for the US. So you're getting wealthier migrants. We've had a migration shift since COVID where, we had a lot of Chinese migration. We're now having a lot of Indian migration. So lots of people are Hindu. We're having some Middle Eastern migration, but also increasingly New Zealanders and Europeans and so on who tend to be secular. So really partially that's about a change in our migrant makeup, but also people who are either from another religion, which is understandable, but also who are wealthier, who are less in crisis coming to Australia. Now, traditionally in Australia, I always sort of thought people who were sort of Australian born were more resistant, because that had been my experience for a lot of part of life.
Sure, yeah.
And there was the Aussie comfort Australian dream. But then over 55s, why is that interesting? Now, there were two other interesting lines as well. Also, interestingly too, another significant group coming to faith in that 785 is Indigenous Australians as well. And we heard stories of various moves of God that's happening in different Indigenous communities around Australia. So that's a really interesting story. But it's interesting that the over 55s, it's also people who've been recently divorced or recently widowed. And so I think reading this is this something different than what's happening with Gen Zs in other places? Now, Gen Zs in Australia, Gen Zs or Gen Z in Australia are also quite open to spiritual conversations. But it's actually, I think, Australians who've had a fairly comfortable life, or get to the age of 55 and beyond, may become widowed, or all of a sudden they're facing their mortality, have a health crisis.
Yes.
All of a sudden, youth is not on their side, and they see the world changing, or migrants that don't have a need. The difference too with millennials in Australia as well is that we went through many millennials in other countries went through the GFC. Australia didn't experience the GFC because we didn't even go into recession because of our economic resilience during that time. But the cost of living crisis is hitting millennials in Australia as one of the first things that they've experienced, where while people in America, millennials may have been struggling, or Europe or whatever, Australian millennials were actually doing well, economically. So really, there actually is a similarity, between, say, a Gen Z who's in London or a Gen Z in the United States. They've gone through a lot of difficulty, and the over 55 in Australia, or a millennial, actually has also gone through difficulty. So I think that what we're seeing here is one of the great mantras, crisis precedes renewal.
Yes.
So it's less like Gen Z's the future. It's actually where is. Now, also, this is 2021. So some of the trends we're seeing in the UK and the US are actually post-2021.
Sure.
And I'd love to see more up-to-date research in Australia, because I actually suspect we're going to see an uptick in Gen Z, even if just the cultural influence of, say, the US and Europe in Australia is quite big. So you're going to see a flow-on effect. But really what you're seeing is, in the midst of all this myriad of crises that we talk about on this podcast and challenges, is that this is resulting in a massive evangelistic opportunity.
Yes. Which is so interesting. I mean, you kind of alluded to it before, that you haven't experienced this in your lifetime. You're used to, particularly here in Australia, you're fighting an uphill battle if you're trying to share about your faith, and you feel like you're going to get shut down. And I'm speaking from my own experience here, like it's a scary thing to share that publicly, but to see the tide turning and having evidence of that is a really big mind shift for so many people. And I think, I can't remember that you mentioned this before we started recording, but you said something about this is the stuff that we've been praying for, that we've been contending for. That contending prayer has been, God, will you move?
Yes.
He's moving now.
Yes.
And it reminds me of the verse in Isaiah where it says, see, I'm doing a new thing. Do you not perceive it? And I wonder if there's a number of us, and I'm speaking for myself as well, that need to come to perceiving it.
Yes.
And being like, yes, God, I do perceive it and I'm going to respond.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it's really interesting. Mark McCrindle in this Australian report, called it an undercurrent of faith. And an undercurrent's really interesting. You can surface currents, which you can sometimes see, if you think of a body of water, but then there can be these undercurrents. There can be rips, which you don't see, which are under the surface as the water lower is moving. And so there's a current which we see of secularization, and that's what dominates the media. Is that happening in lots of places? Yes. You are seeing decline. But then I was surprised in the Australian data. I won't flick through the book right now, but I think church attendance in Australia had gone up by 5% in the last 5 years. And some of that are they including online church data? Is that meaning more people can come? But I think there's probably a genuine growth in certain places. But again, too, there is these. Let's go back to what I said at the beginning. I talked about the economy at the moment is utter volatility. One day it's up. Trump makes some comment about iPhones and it's up. And then the next day, Howard Lutnick makes a saying, oh, no, there's going to be another tariff bucket. And the market is just jumping up and down. In some ways, that is what's happening with faith at the moment. And so, you see these twin movements. In some places, young adults are leaving who are part of the church, but then people who are way outside of the church are coming in. In Australia, it's really interesting that I think 24% of baby boomers are, regular church attenders. And even that smashes the narrative, that in Australia, you would think that baby boomers are the most religious, most attending. It's actually millennials, that no one was thinking. I've not heard anyone say that, but this is what the data is saying. So good on you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Let's hear it for the millennials.
Yeah.
Slow hand claps here. But what's also interesting as well is at the very moment where baby boomers in the church in Australia seem to be disconnecting from the church or attending less is the very moment that their peers of no faith are starting to be interested in faith. So that line you have there is 100% right. Do you not perceive it?
Yes.
And look, even for me, I came out of this and I realized my bias is if I'm at a bus stop or something and there's a young overseas student, who's non-European, I, in my mind, presume they're more open to faith than the, very sort of Anglo-European Aussie next to me who's in their 50s. This is saying I'm wrong. Do you know what I mean? Why? Because all my learned stuff up till then, and because in Australia, you often have multi-generational, my dad came to faith in his family, but his family was multi-generational unchurched. That's very normal in Australia amongst sort of Anglo-Saxon Celtic people have multi-generations of no faith. But what it's saying is under the currents, something is significantly shifting and we need to look where, this could be happening. And it's going to keep shifting. That's the other thing. As the world gets more chaotic, so the big thing now is not like, well, let's throw all our resources at the over 55. I suspect once we start to get some data in the next 12 months or whenever that comes out, say in Australia, is that Gen Z is going to, possibly be, on the uptick. And, it could be the same in the United Kingdom or Norway or wherever that your expectations and the learned map of the world as to who is interested in faith is based on a period of less crisis and chaos. We're now heading into what Adam Tooze calls the polycrisis, and it's only going to intensify. Let's just chuck this out there. That Grace, my daughter, was telling me just before I was driving her, I'm quoting you, Grace, that in economic recessions and depressions, skirts go higher and lower, which is fascinating.
As in women wearing skirts.
Yeah, so when there's more economic turmoil, skirts get longer. And then, so in the 20s, there were the flappers, skirts went higher. In the 60s, they went higher, and in the 70s, they came down. And part of this is risk-taking and confidence and, modesty, and people turn traditional values, blah, blah, blah. So, economic conditions change something like skirts, but also when the things that you look to, you can't trust them in the same way. And we've talked about this endlessly. Secularism is weaker than we think. We've seen that already. And yes, we've had a cost of living crisis, but we haven't really had a proper recession. God forbid a depression. Most of the experts are saying, and even many people who would be in the Trump basket are saying, this is a good idea, but executed poorly. There's even infighting now. Like I said, this was a Steve Bannon move last time. He's out there now bagging out Howard Lutnick saying he's messing this up. So even the most ardent Trump people are fearing that this is being done badly. And then you've got sort of more mainstream economists saying that this is going to cause recessions. As I said last time, maybe that's just in the US. I think it's going to be more wider than that. That's going to change, again, the spiritual openness of people because we're affected by material things. If over 55 in Australia are more open to faith, I think a big part of that is as you become more aware of your mortality, as you're rocked by illness, as you lose, a spouse, as you hit financial rock bottom, people who go to prison, like all these things major life events, when someone near you, a loved one dies, when people have a baby, all these things open you up to spiritual questions. We're about to see millions of people enter this. So we need to change our expectations.
Yeah. So the green light is happening. How do we respond?
Can I just tell you a story? So
Sure.
on this, literally driving here, I was driving here before and I was actually thinking about this, and then I thought, I've been thinking about all this stuff. I was writing a sermon. I thought I just need a break. So I put on a podcast, and as a finance podcast, I thought I'll try and understand what's happening in the markets at the moment with all this stuff going on. And literally I'm a few minutes into this podcast and the two guys are saying, and I've listened to this podcast before, and they're basically saying that we're almost in this, what they called it, like financial nihilism. And there's almost no model. They're like, there's no model to understand what's going to happen. They're like, no one knows what's going to happen with these tariffs. And then they basically made this comment that their friend or something had written something about how this is going to turn people to sort of spiritual questions. And one of the guys is like, I'm totally not religious, but everyone I know in sort of this finance world is thinking about this big time is all of a sudden talking about religion and God. And then the other guys talk about grace and forgiveness. And then I'm just like, in what? Hang on. I'm on I can understand, we're seeing now scientists talking about faith and people in the arts and politics and history and all these spaces. I'm now on listening to a finance podcast, not with Christian people that I'm aware of. And then all of a sudden it's turning religious because they're just like, this is exposing the bigger stuff going on. So again, too, that I just tell that story as be prepared for where people who you thought were shut off all of a sudden could be asking questions.
Well, if that's the kind of green light stuff that you're talking about, how do we then respond as the people of God?
Well, I think that, there was something that came through in the Australian sort of research that, very much people sort of coming to a church, encountering faith or exploring faith are very much wanting to feel a sense of peace and feel a sense of God's presence. The second thing is that they're looking for community. Like we are fast moving into huge social isolation, and not just a lack of community, but a lack of even knowledge of how to do community well. And I just come a little sort of catchphrase, that means that to cut through as the people of God, we need to create spaces and places where people encounter the presence of God and the presence of people animated by the presence of God. And so, I think that this is, something that, there's churches which are contemporary, there's churches which are liturgical, there's churches which are, big on the word, there's churches that are big on worship, all of these things are important. But I think and we've heard this a lot at Red, it's really interesting, people coming in saying, oh, wow, I walked in the door and I felt the presence of God. That's what they're naming. And, I think that that's really hard to programatize. Hey guys, can you just give me a run? Give me a sheet of 5 steps to increase our presence by Tuesday. Like there's this, not something you can give to the intern. That comes from a church, a people, building a culture where you pursue the presence of God. So the contending prayer is still key. I'm not saying stop the contending prayer and just go and do street evangelism. No. When you have churches which are dependent. Now, the interesting thing as well is one thing I picked up from the Australian data, which I think is really good news for the Aussie church and I think helpful for churches overseas, and maybe we're ahead of this. This may be true in Northern Europe. I don't think the US is here yet, is why are 75% of millennials and 68% of Gen Zs in Australia regular churchgoers, if you say a Christian? Cultural Christianity is dead in Australia. This is what's happened. And, cultural Christianity, the fact that people who previously saw themselves as cultural Christians in Australia don't tick that anymore, that's died as a concept. Now, little pointer for people who are outside of Australia, I think partially that's also because cultural Christianity in Australia was very weak. It's not tied to a political party.
Yeah.
Maybe in 1956 when, Queen Elizabeth came to Australia, people might have thought, I'm an Anglican or something. That's gone. So what you're seeing in the Aussie church, and I think this is actually good, a good outcome, is if you're under 45, the Aussie church is a remnant church now. So you don't need to socially attract people. You don't need to put on an event just to keep, people socially activated so they hang around. Yeah. If they are there, a millennial is at your church, probably most of their mates aren't, and it's probably actually culturally against the script for them to come, but they're there. If a Gen Z is at your church, they're going against the cultural script. So again, too, it's not going to be the whole of Gen Z, it's not going to be the whole of millennials. It's the remnant in Gen Z and the millennials, which is key. That's really key. So when you've got when cultural Christianity is dead or dying, and you've got a remnant church, that's a completely different place to do ministry and mission, and that's a place where if you direct those people, because they're there because they want Jesus, they want God. And interesting, even in Australia, and this may be helpful for those listening to youth ministry, increasingly hearing youth pastors saying, our young people now, they don't want the games night, they don't want just the fun games and the distraction. They're looking for prayer. They want Jesus. They're wanting presence. They wanting worship. They're wanting to do mission. So I think that's really key.
All right. So the next point you have here is compelling church is the cut through.
Yeah, it's interesting again too. I'm sort of I should quote it exactly somewhere here in the McCrindle report, but they were making some comments around deconstruction and people sort of take apart their faith and so on in Australia, and I know that may be a bigger thing in other countries or whatever, but it made the point that people are more leaving not because of this faith issue with this belief or whatever, but actually are leaving because of a lack of a compelling church. And I think that's really, really key. The churches that are seemingly meeting this moment are actually, and the ministries are the ones that are compelling. Some are liturgical, there are Catholic parishes that are growing at a rapid rate.
Yeah.
There are churches that are filled with the presence of God, evangelical churches. There are churches that are contemporary churches, but not all of those churches are also. The key cut through is compelling. This is a place where it's alive. You feel the presence of God. It's not entertainment is not the compelling factor. It's God. You're finding something there that's very different to the culture.
Yes.
And I just want to make a real key nuance here. I think there's a danger then, again too, because we're thinking of the red light period or the amber light period, culture war, whatever. So they're making a moral stand about the cultural drift of the culture. That can be part of it, but it's not moralism alone. Mm-hmm. It's actually an encounter with God,
yes,
where you hear the gospel preached, you see it lived, you're able to live the life of the church, taking communion, baptism, walking with others. There's a compelling sense of the presence of God. It's not trying to do church exactly like the world. Obviously, there's still elements of relevance and the language, and there's a missiological dimension to all of that, of course. But the compelling church angle is really key. So I think asking that question, what is going to make our church a compelling church, is really key. Not an entertaining church, a compelling church.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any examples of what that might look like?
I think it's when people are wanting to hear something very different than you hear in the world. I think it's someone coming and, we just heard a story yesterday. Staff team, we talked about some of this, and someone's talking about a friend who, went to church in Europe and, just went to this church, and they were telling the story of Christians in a persecuted country who were fully living for their faith. And this person was just like, I've not heard that before. I'm paraphrasing, to hear this is what it is to fully live for Christ, to sacrifice your life for Christ. That's a compelling message. Yeah. Just like, hey guys, here's a bit of a Jesus message. I know you don't like religion, but we're going to turn the laser lights on and have a rave afterwards. And if you want to come and talk to me, come and talk to me. That was my whole ministry experience in the 90s, just captured in a moment there. That's in the great. Early 2000s. There's something compelling where people hear something really different. Yeah. A whole of life invitation. The actual good news of Jesus preached and communicated and lived. The presence of God, the Holy Spirit as a palpable person of the Trinity who is here to empower us. I think that's what it is. I'm sort of hesitant too, because I know they've got people in all different denominations and big and small churches, and I don't. This is not about size of church. It's about would people come and go, wow, these guys really believe it and live it, and this feels like what the New Testament could have been like. That's compelling.
Can I just make a quick point in there as well? I think part of what I'm hearing you say in my experience as well is people see through the whole thing of secularism. Is people have seen through the talk and the ideas and and I think that's true where people look at the church and if all they see is just I don't know, you're saying one thing but you're doing another, hypocrisy really, then there's little regard for that. And I don't I see that in the world, not interested. I see that in church, not interested.
Yes.
I think where people see, hang on, you actually live what you preach, and that discipleship, who you talk about, the way you talk about Jesus is also modeled in your life. Like that, I think is particularly compelling because it's got something solid to that and it's a lived reality, not just hearsay.
100%. Yeah.
And the final point you have here is discipleship. And does this make a difference in my life? What do you mean by that?
Again, too, I think that there has been this element where it's like, oh, this is going to be a good faith addition to my life. Is church a bit of a utility that gives me a little bit of meaning, because, just a little bit of a meaning deficit. I think people need to understand how, again, too, there was a comment somewhere, I think in the McCrindle report, something around, it's like deconstruction. It's almost more, this is me paraphrasing or perhaps adding to it, but it's like Aussie young people are not deconstructing their faith as much as they're deconstructing everything, and I think in Australia, the Aussie dream, as we've called it, which is, you can get a job, everyone's going to sort of be economically equal, get the house and the backyard and the dog and everything, and that's all going to be great. People are deconstructing that. They're deconstructing the economic story of the world. They're deconstructing the historical story. They're deconstructing all of these things. And Peter Berger talked about plausibility structures, that, a belief is plausible and it makes sense and you'll live it when it makes a lived difference in your life. Now, two things are happening simultaneously we need to be aware of. And this is a good way to sort of sum all this up. Number one, the plausibility structure of the world is breaking big time. So it's not like, again, 1992 or 1985 or even literally, dare I say, 2016, or 2018, where it's like, wow, the world's really cool and that's awesome, and I got to go to church and we've got to sort of convince them to come in. Like, the world is looking broken and it's only going to get more broken, is the trend line from here. So the plausibility structure of the world is breaking. That means people are looking for something, but they'll then take on faith when it makes Berger said, when it makes a tangible difference in their life. So I have anxiety. Are you showing me in your life how following Jesus is helping you with your anxiety? Are you showing me how Jesus actually helps me connect to other people better? Does following Jesus with all my life make a tangible difference in my life? If you've got a compelling, this is also another way to answer the compelling church question. Compelling church is filled with people who that is happening to. Is it going to be everyone? No, but are there active, I'm going to use that term, pillars in this church who are living, go, wow, I want that. I want to live like that. So again, you go through different periods of the church. You think about St. Benedict during the Dark Ages or late antiquity, when the Roman world was really collapsing. And then you had these monastic communities, which were, places where businesses were flourishing and there was an order to the sense of life and there's a sense of protection and community and God was there. That was alternate plausibility structures in the midst of the culture. And I think that's what people are looking for now, not just cool music and, I don't know, a preacher with awesome jeans.
So great. Thank you so much, Mark, for the way that you've led us through that.
I'd like to end with encouragement.
Sounds good.
I think that, again, to tracking with the story of so many people who've just sent emails in and messages over the last 5 years, we've been doing this now. just really aware that traffic light system is what people have gone through. Many people hit a red light or live for a long time in an amber light. And I just want to repeat something I sort of said quickly earlier, about faithfulness and fruitfulness. I think there's been a lot of people who've listened to this and I think God's hopefully used it in your life to encourage you. We know lots of people have written to us and sort of said it's, been a sort of bit of a beacon of sanity as so many things seem insane around them, and sometimes sadly even in the church. And so there's a lot of people we know who have with grit and determination pushed through in this period. Churches have diminished, friendships have been lost, there's been lots of isolation and so on. And in the midst of that, people pushing into contending and praying and having hope and small spot fires, and I think of people in smaller churches, rural places, remote places, tough life circumstances and so on. And again, to thank you to all the people who've written in. We wish we could get back to everyone. We can't. It's just too many. But I just want to just dare to suggest that perhaps you feel as you're in amber, but the light is turning green. And that part of that faithfulness has been also a formation period, which has built resilience in you, which has built dependency in you, which has built a depth that you may not see when you look in the mirror. Like if you've got a new haircut, you look in the mirror, you can tell. But often when God is shaping you on the inside, you cannot see it. And it's like my kids grow and I don't notice it because I'm with them every day. And then you bump into someone down the street who hasn't seen them for a couple of years, like they're gigantic. That has happened in many, many of you. There's been a spiritual growth that has happened in you. And, I just think that there is this, maybe it's amber and it's turning green. I think the light's turning green and it's at different paces in different countries. We hear that, different challenges, different countries. I wanted to give some of the Aussie nuance because there is nuance in different countries. But I think we're heading into, despite some of the difficulty in the world, the good spiritual news is we're heading into a green light moment. And so I think that God is wanting to say to many of you, your faithfulness will lead to fruitfulness. The faithfulness over the last few years will lead to a fruitfulness. So go out there with expectancy. Go out there with a renewed faith. Go out there, have risky conversations with people. Go and have conversations and know that the Holy Spirit's with you. He's been forming you. God's been forming you. And I think that even when the cultural script may be falling over, there is a bright future for many people. Is it going to look amazing? Am I saying that you're going to – I said this to someone recently. They were in Europe and I said, if you can get 60 young adults to a 5 p.m. service in one of your cities, that's brilliant. So some of you may not be like looking going, I haven't got 20,000 people in my church or 5,000 or 500 at this moment to actually just move the dial forward with Jesus and go – here's a group of us and we're moving forward. That's incredible. So if your youth group goes from 6 to 17, that's amazing. So keep going. Faithfulness leads to fruitfulness.
So good.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mark. If you're listening and you want a list of any of the things that we've referenced in today's episode, you can subscribe to our mailing list by heading to rebuilders.co and signing up there. We send out an email a few days after each episode. So please join us there and please join us for our next episode.
Can I just add in that I realize some people don't know there's actually a video we record that go into the subscriber chats as well.
Correct, yeah.
I was chatting to someone the other day and they realised there's a video. I'm like, bonus content.
Well, the bonus content is us a bit unleashed, just to like, I mean, sort of we get to the end and we let it all hang out.
Great. So I look forward to that.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Thanks, Daniel. See you next time.